If you heard desperate howling in the freezing woods, would you walk away or follow it? That's the question that cracked open the quiet life of George Whitman, a retired firefighter living alone in the snowy hills of northern Idaho. George hadn't spoken more than a few words to anyone in months. Since his wife died 2 winters ago, the old cabin they once shared had become a tomb of silence. He filled his days stacking firewood and his nights staring into a fireplace that never got warm enough. The grief was no longer sharp, it was dull and constant, like the ache in his knees. He avoided phone calls, left meals half-eaten, and spent hours watching the snow fall. That morning had started like the others: bitter wind, the smell of pine, and the distant cry of a raven. But that sound wasn't what stopped him in his tracks. It was a howl, raw, desperate, not a coyote, not distant, it was close. George paused on the narrow trail that led behind his cabin. He was supposed to be checking the trap cameras he used to track elk, his only hobby since retirement, but this sound didn't belong to elk. He turned his head, listening again. There it was, closer now. He tightened the scarf around his neck, turned off the trail, and pushed through the thick brush. The snow swallowed his boots and bit at his fingers, even through the gloves. As he stepped deeper into the woods, the trees grew tighter and the sound sharper. It wasn't just a howl, it was pain. Panic, a plea. George knew that sound. He'd heard it come from people before, in burning buildings or crushed vehicles. Now it was coming from the forest. He didn't stop to think, just followed. 50 yards off the trail, he found her. Under a bent pine, half covered in snow and shaking violently, lay a gray she-wolf. Her belly was distended, sides heaving, eyes wide and wild. Her fur was matted with ice and blood. George froze, heart hammering. She saw him, didn't growl, didn't move, just stared. Her breathing was ragged, and her back legs kicked weakly in the snow. He looked around, no tracks, no den. She was alone, abandoned, laboring in the open with no cover, no pack, and time was running out. George dropped to his knees, not even sure why. She was a wild animal. But something about her eyes so full of pain and something close to trust pulled him in. Years of emergency calls, birth complications, and late-night rescues flooded back. He didn't think, he acted. He unzipped his coat and laid it next to her, using it as a buffer from the snow. Her body convulsed, a tiny shape emerged. Wet, trembling, a pup. George gently cleared its face with the corner of his scarf and placed it near her stomach. Another contraction, a second pup slid out, then a third. He worked quietly, his hands shaking more from emotion than the cold. Each life felt impossibly fragile. The she-wolf never looked away. She didn't snarl, didn't resist. She seemed to know he was trying to help, and George, who hadn't felt needed in years, suddenly couldn't imagine walking away. By the time the 5th pup was born, the snow was falling harder. George's knees were soaked, the wolf's breathing slowed. Her body started to twitch, not from labor, but something else. Her eyes rolled back, her legs stiffened, and a deep, guttural cry escaped her chest. George leaned in, trying to steady her head. Her chest rose once, then stopped. Silence. She was gone. Just like that, the forest held its breath. George sat still, staring at the body beside him and the 5 tiny pups wriggling blindly in the snow. A strange numbness set in. He had come here expecting nothing. Now he held 5 lives and the warm body of a mother that would never know them. One of the pups let out a faint squeal. The others crawled over each other, drawn to what little warmth they could find. George reached into his pack, pulling out a flannel shirt, then gently tucked each pup inside, wrapping them together. They twitched and wriggled, eyes sealed shut. He looked down at the she-wolf. Her body was still, but something caught his eye. Just under her paw, half buried in the snow, was a thin strip of metal. George leaned closer, brushed the snow away, and lifted it. A tag, worn but legible. It read, Luna, property of Wildlife Rescue ID 462. His chest tightened. She wasn't wild. She had once belonged to someone. She had known people. This changed everything. She wasn't just a wolf. She was failed by someone, a system, a person. Whatever had brought her out here to die alone, it wasn't nature. It was abandonment. George looked at the 5 small lives wriggling inside his shirt. Their mother had been someone's responsibility. And now, without warning, they were his. He didn't know if they'd survive. Didn't know how long they'd last in the cold. But he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't walk away. Not again. Not when something still had a chance. He stood up, knees stiff, and looked toward the trees, where the outline of his cabin lay somewhere behind the storm. He laid the pups gently into the small firewood sled he'd been dragging. Tucked them under the coat, tied it down with rope. Then he turned back to the mother one last time. The scarf he had wrapped around her was stained dark now. He knelt beside her, whispered something he didn't know what, and brushed snow from her face. She looked peaceful. He wished he could have done more. Then he rose, grabbed the sled rope, and started walking. The wind whipped around him, but he kept moving. One step, then another. Behind him, the 5 pups trembled in silence. But ahead he didn't know what waited, only that he had to try. The wind howled louder, echoing between the trees. George leaned into it, boots sinking deep into the drifts. Every muscle in his back screamed. His breath came in short, white bursts. But he didn't stop, not for a second. 2 miles separated him and the cabin. 2 miles with 5 newborns. He thought of turning back, of building a shelter. But no, they needed warmth, milk, life, and they needed it now. His legs burned, his fingers stung, but his heart beat harder than it had in years. Every cry from the sled behind him pulled him forward, like a hook in his chest. He hadn't saved her. But just maybe, he could save them. Then he froze, a sound behind him. A crunch in the snow, slow, deliberate. He turned. Eyes scanning the tree line. It wasn't the wind. Something moved. He stepped toward it, heart hammering. And there, in the same spot where Luna had died, he saw her paw twitch. Just once, barely a flicker, but it was enough to steal the breath from his lungs. She wasn't gone, not yet. George dropped the sled rope and ran, fell to his knees beside her. She was breathing shallow, erratic, but alive. His hands flew into motion. He wrapped her tighter, spoke to her without thinking. "Stay with me, please, stay," the pups in the sled whimpered. George's heart was torn in two. He couldn't carry them all. Luna was over 70 pounds, and the sled couldn't take the weight. He looked at the sky darkening fast, then back at her. Her eyes fluttered open. Barely, but she saw him. That was enough. He made the hardest decision of his life. He opened the sled, unwrapped the pups, and laid them gently against her belly. One by one, they found her warmth, found her, their mother. He stacked wood around them, built a windbreak with his jacket and pine branches. Then he sat beside them, guarded them, through the night. As darkness fell, George stayed in that frozen clearing, feeding the fire he made with dry bark from his pack. He gave Luna water with a dropper from his first aid kit. He held the pups close to her when her shivers worsened. And he prayed not because he believed in much anymore, but because it was all he had left. When the first stars appeared above the trees, he heard the faint sound of a pup suckling. Then another. Luna stirred, shifted. Her body curved protectively around them. George leaned back against a tree, exhausted. He had come into the woods for silence. What he found was a second chance. By the time the sun crept over the tree line, the fire had nearly died and George's joints ached like stone. His coat was stiff with frost, his gloves frozen solid. But he didn't dare leave them, not the she-wolf, not her newborns. Luna had survived the night, barely. Her breath came in slow waves, and her body remained weak. But the pups were alive, all 5 of them. Nestled against her side, drawing warmth and milk from the little she could give. George didn't sleep. He couldn't. He spent the night listening for sounds in the dark: predators, wind shifts, anything that might mean danger. When morning came, he moved quickly. He had a window. Maybe. He had to get them all to the cabin. Leaving Luna behind wasn't an option anymore. She had fought through death for her pups. For him. And now, they were his responsibility. He built a makeshift harness from paracord and used broken tree limbs to reinforce the sled. Then, inch by inch, he lifted Luna onto it. She didn't resist, didn't growl. She just watched him, her golden eyes clouded but calm. Her breathing was labored, but steady. The pups whimpered as he placed them in a nest of wool blankets beside her. He tied everything down, double-checked every knot. And then, gripping the rope with frozen fingers, he started the long walk home. The trail back was uphill, slick with fresh snow and hidden roots. Each step was a battle. George leaned forward, using his weight to pull the sled inch by inch. He stopped only to rest the rope on his hip and breathe through the pain. Luna made no sound. The pups occasionally cried out, short, sharp squeals that made George press harder. He didn't speak, not to himself, not to the woods. His focus narrowed to one goal: get them home. His cabin came into view just as the clouds thickened again, dark with more snow. He pushed forward, the final stretch, the porch. The door, warmth, safety. Inside, he turned his living room into a triage center. The couch was stripped for its cushions, towels warmed by the fireplace. A space heater placed beside the pup basket. Luna was laid on a sleeping bag and covered with his thickest quilt. He fed the pups milk from a bottle he fashioned out of an old water tube and rubber gloves. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. They fed in turns, squeaking and wriggling like blind mice. George used honey water to hydrate Luna, rubbing it gently into her gums. Every few hours, she blinked. A sign, a hope. Her tail moved slightly once. He nearly cried. He called every wildlife number he could find, but the roads were closed. A massive snowstorm had shut down access to the mountain. No one could get up, and he couldn't go down. For the next 48 hours, they were alone. George rationed what little food he had left, giving most of it to Luna in a mushy broth he made from boiled beef jerky and bone broth. The pups were gaining strength barely, but enough to fight for a spot near their mother's belly. George didn't sleep more than 20 minutes at a time. Every sound, every breath, every twitch from Luna sent him checking on them again. By the third day, Luna tried to lift her head. Her neck gave out and she collapsed, but it was movement. The pups were fatter now, pinker. One even opened its mouth wide enough to try a yawn. George felt something strange and terrifying inside him. Joy. It had been so long. He kept telling himself not to get attached. They were wild animals, temporary. But the way they curled up against his chest when he bottle-fed them, it stirred something old in him. He didn't want to think about what would happen when help arrived. If they tried to take them away, or worse, put them down. He took pictures, logged their weights, tracked feedings on a yellow legal pad. Each pup got a temporary name: Scout, Echo, Fern, Tumble, and Rune. It helped to say their names aloud. Made the silence bearable, Luna began eating tiny bites on her own. Her eyes followed George whenever he moved around the room. She still couldn't stand, but she was healing. And so was he, slowly, quietly. The cabin, once dead and hollow, now buzzed with new life. Blankets everywhere, bottles, heat lamps made from repurposed desk lights. It smelled like wet fur and broth. It felt alive. But then the call came. The rescue center had finally cleared a path through the lower trails and was sending a team up by snowmobile. They'd be at his cabin within the hour. George froze. He stared at the pups, now sleeping in a bundled mass at the foot of the fireplace. Luna's head was on his boot. She had started to wag her tail each time he approached. He didn't know what the rules were. Didn't care. He knew what this place had become. Not just a shelter but a home. He stood in the doorway, eyes burning, the phone still in his hand. He had to make a choice. He thought of his wife. Of how they'd planned to foster dogs after retirement. How she used to leave bowls of food out on the porch in winter just in case. How she believed every creature deserved a warm place to rest. George looked at the pups, then at Luna. The team would want to evaluate her, might decide she was too compromised. Might separate them. He couldn't allow that. Not after everything. He began gathering supplies: collars, extra blankets, canned food. If they were taking them, they'd take them ready, healthy, loved. And if they tried to take them away for good, they'd have to go through him. When the knock came, George opened the door without hesitation. 2 officers and a vet tech entered, surprised by the sight. The cabin was transformed: heat lamps, blankets, logs burning high in the fireplace. The pups squeaked and tumbled as the tech approached. Luna lifted her head weakly, growled, just once, then went silent again. The vet knelt beside her. Took vitals, checked the pups. He was quiet, gentle. Then he looked at George. "You did more than we ever could have asked," he said. "You saved them." But George didn't smile. He only asked one question: do they have to go? The officers exchanged glances. The vet hesitated. Luna's registered, technically still property of the state. The pups, they were born in the wild, but this isn't a shelter. You can't keep wolves, sir. George felt the weight of that sentence. The finality. He looked down at Luna. She nudged his boot again. Then he looked up and said, I'm not asking to keep wolves. I'm asking to keep my family. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then the younger officer said quietly, We'll call the director. Explain the situation. Maybe there's something we can do. It wasn't a yes. But it wasn't a no. They stayed for hours, took samples, scanned Luna's chip, logged data, took photos of George holding each pup. The vet even showed him how to stimulate Luna's muscles to aid her recovery. As the sun set, they packed up their gear. We'll be in touch, one of them said. You're not in trouble. But don't go posting this online just yet, George nodded. When they left, the silence returned. But it wasn't empty, it was full of breath, of life. He sat down, exhausted. Luna leaned her head against his leg. The pups piled on top of each other, twitching in their sleep. Something had changed, permanently. That night, as the fire crackled and the storm outside began again, George sat on the floor and cried. Not for sadness, not for grief, but for release. For the first time in years, he felt needed, alive. He didn't know what the next days would bring: legal battles, vet bills, bureaucracy, but he didn't care. For now, they were safe, warm, together. And for now, that was enough. He wiped his eyes, reached over, and adjusted the blanket over Luna's back. We're gonna figure it out, he whispered. And somehow, he believed it. The next morning, George woke to the sound of soft scratching, tiny paws moving across the hardwood floor. The pups were exploring, wobbling like drunk marionettes, their legs still too weak to hold them upright for long. Scout barked for the first time, a squeaky hiccup of defiance that startled even Luna. She had regained enough strength to sit up now, though she still needed help to stand. George had built a low ramp to the porch and opened the front door for air. The pups ran toward the light but stopped when they hit the cold breeze. They turned around and piled back into the warmth. He laughed, a deep, honest laugh. Luna watched them closely, her head tilted as if counting. George noticed that she would only rest once all five were within eyesight. Even in her fragile state, her instinct to protect was stronger than pain. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was a nursery. George rearranged everything. The TV was unplugged. The recliner pushed aside. He cleared space for sleeping mats and soft corners made from folded towels. He hadn't cleaned like this in years, not since before his wife got sick. And somehow, it felt good. The motion, the purpose, the sense that each hour meant something again. On the fourth day, a delivery truck from the wildlife center arrived at the bottom of the trail. The two young volunteers hauled up supplies by sled with food, vitamin powder, syringes, blankets, even toys. They didn't ask questions, just smiled, took pictures for documentation, and called George the Wolf Dad. He didn't like the name, but he didn't correct them either. One of them whispered that the director was trying to find a legal workaround. Maybe a rehabilitation contract, maybe custody under special exemption. George nodded. He didn't want to hope yet, but he felt it rising anyway, like spring under the snow. He started taking notes for real, tracking the pups' personalities, their feeding habits, even which ones growled in their sleep. He wrote it all down in a thick notebook with his wife's name still etched on the cover. Merry Christmas lists. Now it was filled with survival notes, weight logs, temperature charts. George read every article he could find about neonatal wolf care. He reached out to biologists online, using a friend's satellite email. Some responded with concern, others with amazement, but all agreed on one thing: the fact that all five had survived this long was nothing short of a miracle. Luna regained mobility faster than anyone expected. Within a week, she was walking short laps around the cabin. She still limped and needed to lie down often, but her coat grew shinier, her eyes clearer. She even began licking George's hand when he refilled her bowl, a gesture he didn't expect from a creature who had every reason not to trust humans. The pups became chaos incarnate, biting socks, chewing table legs, wrestling with each other until they passed out. George began training them in small ways, responding to whistles, associating clicks with food, discouraging nips. He wasn't raising pets. he was raising wild hearts. One afternoon, he caught Luna staring at his wife's photo on the mantel. George had placed it there again, after nearly a year of hiding it in a drawer. It felt right now. Marie had loved animals. She would have adored these pups. He imagined her kneeling on the floor, arms wide, letting them jump all over her. He didn't speak aloud, but he knew somewhere, somehow she saw this. Saw him healing in a way no human conversation ever could have reached, not therapy, not church, not even time, but this accidental family. This snowy miracle in a wooden cabin. News of the rescue began to spread. First in local circles, then on a regional level. A newspaper requested an interview, which George declined. But a vet technician posted a photo of him sleeping on the floor beside the pups, one curled on his chest, another in his beard. The image went viral. Thousands of shares. Comments flooded in. This man is a saint. Some heroes wear flannel. I wish he was my dad. George didn't understand half of it, but the center reached out again, now offering official foster status under supervision. It wasn't ownership, but it was a beginning. Inspectors came, took notes, observed the conditions, asked about diet, routine, sanitation. George answered everything, calm and confident. They nodded in approval. One of them, an older woman with sharp eyes, stayed behind afterward. She knelt by Luna and scratched her behind the ear. I've seen wolves bite hands off for less, she said. But she trusts you. George nodded. The woman looked at him, her face softening. We don't see this often, not like this. She stood, wrote something on a clipboard, and left. George didn't ask what she wrote. He just watched her car disappear down the hill and exhaled. That night, George received a letter from the Department of Fish and Wildlife. It wasn't official yet, but it was personal. A handwritten note attached to a typed document. The note said, whatever happened in those woods, we don't want to undo it. We're working on a solution. George held the paper for a long time, the pups asleep all around him. He knew things could still go wrong. Laws were tricky. Wolves weren't dogs. But it was the first time since his wife passed that someone in authority said, we believe in what you're doing. That kind of belief meant something. He started a journal. Not just for logs, but for memories, for stories. The time room got her head stuck in a slipper. The moment Luna howled softly for the first time, waking the pups one by one like a lullaby. George wrote it all down, every tiny miracle, every step of healing, not just for them but for himself. Some days, the weight of it all still hit him. The loneliness that came in strange flashes. But now, when it came, he had 5 reasons to get up. 5 warm bodies crawling into his lap, chasing his sadness out of the room like smoke from a chimney. He started walking farther with Luna, letting her stretch her legs along the ridge. The pups followed in a zigzag of clumsy paws and excited snorts. He taught them boundaries. The frozen stream was off limits. The shed was for quiet time. They began to learn, slowly, but they learned it. George felt like a teacher again, a protector, a man with purpose. His body ached every night, but it was a good ache. One that came with satisfaction, not sorrow. Each evening, they all curled up near the fireplace, Luna at his side, the pups like puzzle pieces across the rug. Then, on the 15th morning, something changed. As the sun hit the tree line, George stepped outside with a cup of coffee. Luna followed. And behind her, each of the 5 pups emerged, one by one, blinking into the light. For the first time, they didn't run back inside. They stood still, smelled the air, tumbled through the snow without fear. George watched them and realized something was shifting. They were no longer fragile. They were growing, changing, becoming. And so was he. The man who had once come into the woods looking for nothing had found everything he didn't know he needed. Spring arrived late that year, but when it came with a quiet sense of renewal. The snow melted in patches, revealing soft earth and tufts of green. George stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching Luna and the pups run free in the clearing he once called his backyard. It no longer felt like a yard. It was their field now, their sanctuary. He had built a low fence around the perimeter, not to trap them, but to mark a space of safety. The pups were larger now, stronger, more coordinated. Their eyes were bright. Their howls small, strange, had begun to echo off the trees. George had memorized each of their personalities. Scout was bold and fast, always testing the edges of the fence. Fern loved lying on Luna's tail, content to be still. Tumble barked at everything that moved. Echo was the quietest, but stared like she understood more than the others. Rune followed George everywhere, the last to fall asleep, the first to nuzzle his chest each morning. Luna had become a different animal altogether, still cautious, but no longer weak. She met George's eyes when he spoke, even nuzzled his hand occasionally. The bond between them, once built in blood and desperation, had grown into something calm and deep. The department's decision arrived in early May. An official letter, signed and sealed, granting George legal stewardship over Luna and the pups under a private wildlife rehabilitation clause. It wasn't ownership. He couldn't sell them, move them across state lines, or let them breed. But they could stay with him, be safe, be together. The center called it a non-traditional foster agreement. George called it a miracle. When he told Luna the news, she didn't react. But something in her eyes shifted like she already knew. That night, she howled, a full, rich sound that made the pups join her in chorus. George started receiving letters. Hundreds of them, from all over the country. People wrote to thank him, to share their own stories of loss and healing. A widow in Maine who had rescued an injured fox. A Vietnam veteran in Arizona who lived alone with a blind pit bull. A child in Iowa who drew a picture of George with wings, calling him Wolf Angel. He tried to answer as many as he could. Some he read out loud to the pups. Some he folded and kept in a box marked Marie's people. Because that's what they were now, witnesses to something real. Something good. One afternoon, a local school invited George to speak. He refused at first, nervous, but they asked again. And this time, he brought photos. Not dramatic ones, just quiet moments. Luna asleep under a quilt, Echo licking snowflakes from George's beard, Rune stealing his sock. He told the kids about instinct, about trust, about how healing doesn't always come in the form you expect. He didn't cry. He almost did, when one little girl asked if the wolves knew he was sad when he found them. Yeah, he said, voice catching. I think they did, and they didn't run from it. They stayed. He began writing full stories, longer entries in his journal. Not just data, but memory. The moment he first saw Luna's eyes. The panic he felt when Tumble stopped breathing for 30 seconds. The look on Luna's face when the pups took their first steps. His grief was still present, but softer now, like a familiar ache. He didn't try to forget Marie anymore. He told her about the pups, about Luna, spoke out loud in the mornings. Hung her wine chime above the porch again. It sang whenever the breeze passed through. Sometimes it rang without wind. Those moments gave him pause. Neighbors, once distant, began stopping by. They brought old blankets, goat's milk, donated fencing. One man offered to help build a second enclosure. Another brought his teenage daughter to volunteer on weekends. George didn't recognize the person he was becoming. More open, patient, willing to explain, to teach. The wolves weren't just transforming, he was too. He realized something one morning as Rune licked his face awake. He hadn't felt alone in months. The cabin, once a place of silence, now pulsed with purpose. With breath, with movement. It was no longer a place he hid from the world. It had become his reason to rejoin it. One night, while brushing Luna's fur near the fire, George caught his reflection in the window. He barely recognized the man staring back. He looked tired, sure but alive, present. His shoulders weren't as hunched. His eyes not as dull. The pups were wrestling behind him, growling in play, full of wild joy. And for a moment, the silence of the cabin felt sacred, not empty. He whispered, "Thank you," not sure if he meant Luna, the pups, or Marie. Maybe all three. Maybe just the woods, which had taken everything from him one winter and given him everything back the next. As the seasons changed again, George adjusted to a new rhythm. Vet visits, check-ins from the wildlife center. Enrichment plans, walks, training. He learned to read body language better than most people do in a lifetime. He knew when Luna was anxious, when Echo needed space. When Scout was about to try and dig under the fence, it wasn't just animal care. It was trust building, relationship building. Every day was an act of connection. Every routine feeding, grooming, watching the sunrise together was a quiet kind of prayer. One that made the grief feel not smaller, but more manageable. The local news ran a follow-up story. This time, George agreed. He didn't do it for attention. He did it because he hoped someone, somewhere, sitting alone like he once had, might see it and choose not to give up. The piece aired one Sunday evening. George watched with Luna beside him, her head on his leg. As the camera showed clips of the pups tumbling over one another, he looked at her and said softly, "They'll never know how close we came to losing everything." Luna didn't respond. But she blinked once, slowly, and stayed there, pressed against him. On the anniversary of his wife's death, George took the pups to the edge of the ridge where he'd spread her ashes. The sky was pink, the valley quiet. Luna stood beside him, not touching, but close. The pups sniffed the air and stayed unusually still. George knelt, placed a photo of Marie in the grass, and whispered, "Look what you started." A gust of wind passed through the trees. The chime he had tied to the branch above sang a single, clear note. And George smiled not with sorrow, but with gratitude. He didn't know where life would go from here, but he was ready. That night, George dreamed for the first time in months, not of fire, not of loss, but of running through deep snow under moonlight, surrounded by fur and breath and laughter. When he woke, all 5 pups were curled around him like a living blanket. Luna was at the hearth, eyes half closed, watching. He whispered, "Good morning, Pack." And for the first time, it didn't feel like pretending. It felt real, honest, right. They weren't pets. They weren't projects. They were family, a strange, sacred one. Built not by blood but by survival, by pain, by something more enduring than either. He began planning for the future. Not because he was afraid but because he finally wanted one. He applied for special wildlife educator status. Drafted plans for a sanctuary trail on his land. Talked to a local nonprofit about collaboration. The past had shaped him, but it would not cage him. George had found a purpose that echoed louder than grief. A reason to rise each morning and say, "Today matters," even on hard days. When Luna struggled to eat or a pup injured a paw, he didn't fall back into the dark. He had something stronger to lean on now. Connection, commitment, life. Luna aged faster than the pups. George could see it in her joints, the stiffness in her gait. But she stayed active, played with them. Nuzzled George's side on cold nights. She had once been seconds from death, in the snow, alone. Now she was safe, loved, witnessed, and George knew when her time came, she wouldn't be forgotten. Her story had touched thousands, but more than that, she had changed one man. Redirected him, pulled him from a slow, quiet death. She hadn't just survived childbirth. She had given birth to something bigger, a second chance for all of them. He built a wooden sign and placed it at the edge of his property. It read, "The Ridge Sanctuary, where the wild are welcome." Beneath it, he carved a single phrase in his wife's handwriting, copied from an old card she once left him. "Love doesn't end in silence." He stood back and looked at it, hand resting on Rune's head. Scout barked from the hilltop. Echo ran in circles, kicking up dust. George smiled, because it was true. The silence was over. The love remained, just louder now. More visible, more alive than he had ever believed possible. In the end, George hadn't just saved a mother Volf and her 5 pups. He had saved the small, beating core of himself that he thought had died with his wife. He hadn't just fed them, warmed them, protected them, he had been transformed by them. In return, they gave him more than gratitude. They gave him a reason, a rhythm, a family. The woods hadn't taken him, they had brought him home. And though the snow would fall again and life would change again, George knew he'd never be truly alone. Because he hadn't just rescued a pack, he had become part of one.